People think becoming a billionaire solves every problem. They're wrong. I built an empire worth billions, owned homes around the world, and employed thousands of people. Yet every birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day reminded me of the one thing money could never buy: the chance to know the man who brought me into this world. I never imagined that the answer would walk into my office carrying nothing more than a mop and a bucket. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we share powerful stories about family, betrayal, forgiveness, redemption, and second chances that remind us how one unexpected moment can change an entire life. Now, let me tell you how hiring one silent janitor changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. My name is Andrew Jones. I am 46 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Cybersecurity, headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago. If you looked at my life from the outside, you would see the quintessential American dream. I grew up in a drafty, two-bedroom apartment in South Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 60 hours a week as a seamstress just to keep the heat on during our brutal Midwestern winters. Today, I sit in a corner office on the 65th floor of a glass skyscraper overlooking Lake Michigan. I wear custom-tailored suits, drive a car that costs more than my childhood home, and when I speak, Wall Street listens. But wealth is a strange thing. It acts like a mirror that magnifies whatever is already inside you. If you are surrounded by love, money amplifies your happiness. But if you are empty inside, money only expands the cavernous void, making you realize just how vast and silent your loneliness truly is. Every morning at 5 o'clock, I was the first person to arrive at the headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline, bathed in the pale, cold hues of dawn. My employees saw me as a hyper-disciplined, tireless leader, a man driven by an insatiable ambition. What they didn't know was that I came in early because I couldn't sleep. The silence of my empty, $10 million penthouse in Lincoln Park was deafening. At least in the office, I could lose myself in lines of code, financial reports, and global security protocols. My mother, Margaret Jones, was the anchor of my life. She was a gentle, fierce woman, with eyes the color of rain-washed slate, and hands that were permanently calloused from thread, needle, and harsh detergent. She gave up everything for me, her youth, her health, her dreams. But she carried a heavy, invisible burden, a shadow that never left her face, even when she smiled. Whenever I asked her about my father, her posture would stiffen. She would gently run her hand through my hair, look toward the window with a distant, haunted gaze and say, "Andrew, some questions are like locked doors. Opening them won't give you peace. It will only let the cold in." She died when I was 16 years old. Cancer took her quickly, eroding her frail frame over 4 agonizing months. On her final night in the sterile, dimly lit ward of Cook County Hospital, as the heart monitor beeped its slow, rhythmic countdown, she pulled me down toward her chest. Her skin smelled of lavender and rubbing alcohol. With her last remaining strength, her fingers gripped my wrist, and she whispered into my ear, "Andrew, my sweet boy, one day you'll understand why your father disappeared. Don't hate him, please." She exhaled her final breath before she could finish the sentence. For 30 years, those words haunted my dreams. Why did he disappear? Did he run away because he didn't want the burden of a family? Was he a coward, a criminal, a deadbeat who chose freedom over fatherhood? Margaret took the answer with her into the earth, leaving me with a burning core of resentment, confusion, and an overwhelming desire to prove my worth to a man who had abandoned me before I was even old enough to remember his face. I conquered the corporate world not just to escape poverty, but to build a fortress so tall that no one could ever leave me again. Yet, despite all the wealth, the boards I chaired, and the awards hanging on my walnut-paneled office walls, I was still that 16-year-old boy sitting beside a cold hospital bed, begging for an answer that never came. It was a Tuesday in early October when the facilities department hired a new night shift janitor for the executive floors. In a company with over 2,000 employees in the headquarters alone, lower-level support staff rarely crossed my radar. Our human resources department handled maintenance outsourcing through a third-party agency, and turned over staff was fairly common. However, Samuel Brooks was different from the moment he set foot on the 65th floor. He was 72 years old, tall but noticeably stooped at the shoulders, as though he had spent decades carrying an invisible iron beam across his back. His hair was stark white, neatly combed back, and his skin was lined with deep, weather-worn crevices that told a story of prolonged hardship. But it was his eyes that caught you off guard. They were a profound, intelligent slate gray, strikingly clear despite his advanced age, carrying a quiet depth that seemed completely out of place for a man pushing a cleaning trolley. Samuel was completely mute. According to the minimal paperwork HR filed, a medical event years prior had rendered him unable to speak. He communicated entirely through subtle gestures, polite nods, and short, meticulously handwritten notes on a small notepad he kept in his front shirt pocket. Because of his disability and his age, the office environment was predictably cruel. Corporate environments, despite their glossy public relations pledges regarding inclusivity, can be brutally dismissive of those at the bottom of the ladder. I observed it firsthand during his second week. I was leaving late one evening, around 8 o'clock, walking through the open-plan marketing suite. A group of mid-level managers was gathered around a desk, drinking takeout coffee and reviewing quarterly projections. Samuel was nearby, quietly emptying trash bins and wiping down the glass partitions. As Samuel reached past one of the younger executives, a sharp-tongued kid named Marcus, who had a habit of treating subordinates like background furniture, Marcus carelessly knocked a plastic container of cold curry off his desk. It splashed across the carpet and splattered against Samuel's worn leather work boots. Marcus didn't apologize. Instead, he let out an annoyed sigh and snapped his fingers. "Hey, old man, watch where you're standing. Clean that up, will you? And try not to take all night. Some of us actually have real work to do." Another manager smirked, whispering loud enough for the room to hear, "Don't bother talking to him, Marcus. He's deaf or dumb or both. HR is really scraping the bottom of the barrel these days." I stopped in my tracks, my jaw clenching. I was about to step in and severely reprimand Marcus for his blatant disrespect. I tolerated high pressure in my company, but never casual cruelty, when I paused to watch Samuel. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't look up with anger or shame. He simply reached into his pocket, retrieved a small microfiber cloth, knelt down on his arthritic knees with slow, measured movements, and began cleaning the mess off the floor and his own shoes. When he finished, he stood up, looked Marcus dead in the eye, and offered a soft, dignified bow of his head. There was no subservience in that gesture. There was only immense, unflinching grace. Marcus looked away first, suddenly looking very small. Samuel walked away, dragging his cleaning cart down the long, carpeted hallway. He never complained. He never demanded respect. He simply moved through the halls like a ghost, doing his work with a quiet, unmatched dignity that began to catch my attention in ways I couldn't yet articulate. By mid-November, Chicago was enveloped in a bitter autumn frost. The winds blew fiercely off Lake Michigan, rattling the thick glass panes of my high-rise office. My workload had doubled due to an upcoming international merger, and I was spending 14 to 16 hours a day at my desk, burning myself out on dark coffee and sheer force of will. It was during this period of high stress that I began noticing small, inexplicable changes around my workspace. Every morning, when I walked into my private office at 5 a.m., the room was immaculate. That in itself was not unusual for executive suite, but the attention to detail was startling. My heavy mahogany desk, usually cluttered with messy piles of security audits and legal briefs, was arranged with mathematical precision. My pens were laid out neatly beside my leather planner. My laptop was wiped clean of smudges. Even the cables behind my desk had been organized and tied with Velcro straps. Then came the coffee. For years, I had ordered expensive espresso from the high-end cafe on the ground floor of our building. But one Thursday morning, I found a heavy ceramic thermos sitting on a coaster beside my keyboard. Attached to it was a small sticky note written in crisp, elegant cursive, "Drink while hot. It is good for long hours." I opened the thermos. The scent that filled the air made me freeze. It was strong black chicory coffee, sweetened with a hint of condensed milk and a dash of ground nutmeg. It was not a recipe you could buy at any coffee shop in Chicago. It was the exact, unique blend my mother used to prepare every Sunday morning in our cramped kitchen when I was a boy. The exact scent of my childhood. My heart hammered against my ribs. I took a slow sip. The taste brought a sudden, overwhelming rush of nostalgia that nearly brought tears to my eyes. It tasted like home. It tasted like Margaret. I called my personal assistant, Sarah, into the office at 8 a.m. sharp. "Sarah," I said, pointing to the thermos, "who brought this in?" Sarah looked confused. "I didn't, Mr. Jones. The morning cleaning crew usually finishes before 4:30 a.m. Maybe someone from catering? Find out," I instructed, my voice tighter than I intended. The following Monday, I walked into my office and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting in a simple glass vase right in the center of my desk was a fresh bouquet of white lilies. White lilies were not common office flora. They were my mother's favorite flowers. Every Mother's Day, despite our poverty, I would save up my allowance coins to buy her a single white lily from the street vendor near our apartment. She used to place it on the kitchen table and tell me that as long as there were lilies in the house, we were rich. I hadn't spoken about my mother's love for white lilies to anyone in this company. It wasn't in any corporate bio, any public profile, or any interview I had ever given. Determined to catch whoever was playing this strange game, I decided to come to the office early the following evening. At 3:30 a.m. on a freezing Wednesday morning, I parked my car in the basement, took the private elevator to the 65th floor, and walked silently down the carpeted corridor toward my suite. The lights in my office were dimmed, save for the soft glow of a desk lamp. Through the glass wall, I saw him. Samuel Brooks was standing beside my desk. He was carefully placing a fresh white lily into the glass vase. He adjusted the flower with tender, trembling fingers. His posture stooped, his breathing slow and heavy in the quiet room. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The soft click of the latch echoed through the space. Samuel stiffened. He turned around slowly, his large, weathered hands gripping the edge of the desk. For a moment, panic flashed across his slate-gray eyes, the look of a man caught doing something he shouldn't be doing. "Samuel," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room as I stepped toward him. "What are you doing in here?" He didn't move. He didn't run. He slowly reached into his front shirt pocket, pulled out his small notepad and a pen, and wrote a brief line before holding it up for me to read. "They bring light to a dark room," his handwriting read. I looked from the pad to the flowers, and then directly into his eyes. "How do you know about the coffee? How do you know about the lilies?" Samuel looked at me for a long, agonizing moment. His lips parted slightly, as if every fiber of his soul was fighting to produce a sound, but only a dry, raspy breath escaped his throat. He offered no written answer. Instead, he offered me a quiet, mournful smile, a smile so laden with unspoken sadness and tenderness that it froze the words in my throat. He gave a slight, respectful bow, picked up his cleaning caddy, and quietly walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the scent of nutmeg and fresh lilies. From that night on, I could not stop watching Samuel Brooks. What had begun as a minor curiosity turned into an absolute obsession. I installed an updated security application on my desktop that allowed me to monitor the floor's internal cameras right from my phone. I found myself pulling up the feeds at random hours, watching this 72-year-old man move methodically through the corridors of my company. The more I observed him, the more extraordinary he appeared. Samuel was not just a janitor doing a job, he was an invisible guardian of the floor. On several occasions, I watched him perform subtle, astonishing acts of care for people who didn't even know he existed. One evening, a senior software engineer named David fell asleep at his desk after a 36-hour coding marathon to patch a critical security flaw. Samuel quietly walked into the room, draped a warm wool blanket over the young man's shoulders, and adjusted the thermostat on the wall so the room wouldn't grow cold overnight. On another occasion, I witnessed Samuel picking up a confidential file that a careless vice president had left sitting open on a printer tray in a public hallway. Instead of leaving it exposed or throwing it away, Samuel carefully placed it inside a sealed envelope, slid it under my office door, and left a small sticky note. Important papers left in open view. He had saved the company from a severe data leak, yet he took zero credit for it. He also paid close attention to me. I have suffered from severe migraines since my late 20s, usually triggered by exhaustion and skipped meals. One afternoon, after back-to-back board meetings, I was sitting in my office with the lights off, rubbing my temples in agony as a brutal headache settled behind my eyes. There was a soft knock on my door. Samuel pushed it open, holding a tray. On it was a glass of ice water, 2 aspirin, and a small, handwritten note. "You cannot carry the weight of the world on an empty stomach. Eat something soon, Andrew." I stared at the note. He had written Andrew, not Mr. Jones. Anyone else in my position would have felt it was an overstep of professional boundaries. A janitor addressing the CEO by his first name was unheard of in a corporation like Aegis. But as I looked at the handwriting, I didn't feel anger. I felt an inexplicable sense of warmth, accompanied by a cold, prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Who was this man? Why was an elderly, mute janitor watching over me like a protective father? Why did his presence feel so strangely familiar, like a half-remembered dream from a life I thought I had lost forever? I decided I couldn't let it rest. I needed to know who Samuel Brooks really was. The turning point occurred on a rainy Friday afternoon in early December. A storm was raging over Chicago, sheet rain hammering against the glass panels of my office. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing financial reports, when Samuel came in to empty the recycling bins. I usually ignored staff when I was focused on work, but this time, I watched him closely out of the corner of my eye. On the left corner of my desk sat a silver frame containing one of my most prized possessions, a black and white photograph taken in 1988. It showed my mother, Margaret, sitting on a wooden bench in a local park. She was 28 years old, radiant, holding a 5-year-old me on her lap. I was laughing, pointing at the camera. It was one of the few photos I had of her before hardship and illness stripped the youth from her face. As Samuel reached across the desk to grab the small wastebasket, his eyes happened to land on the silver frame. He froze instantly. The plastic waste bin slipped from his hand, clattering against the carpet. Samuel didn't notice. His entire body began to tremble violently. His slate-gray eyes dilated, locking onto the face of the young woman in the photograph. I stood up from my chair, my heart suddenly racing. "Samuel, are you all right?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. But the emotional storm tearing through him was plain as day. A low, choked gasp escaped his throat, a sound of profound, unbearable agony. Tears sprang to his eyes, spilling over his weathered cheeks and sinking into the deep lines of his face. With trembling, unsteady fingers, Samuel reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn, scuffed leather wallet that looked at least 40 years old. He opened it with awkward, frantic movements and extracted a small, faded photograph, protected by a worn piece of plastic. He set his photograph down on the mahogany desk, right beside my silver frame. I stepped forward, leaning over the desk to look. My breath caught in my throat. My blood turned to ice. Samuel's photograph showed the exact same woman, Margaret, but she wasn't alone. She was standing next to a tall, handsome young man with thick dark hair, broad shoulders, and striking, intelligent slate-gray eyes. He had his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, and they were both laughing, looking deeply, hopelessly in love. It was my mother. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, it was Margaret Jones, and the man standing beside her was a young Samuel Brooks. My hands began to shake. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I looked up from the faded photograph to the old man standing before me. The resemblance was indisputable. The bone structure, the shape of the jaw, the piercing gray eyes, they were the exact same eyes staring back at me from my own reflection in the mirror every morning. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the sudden weight of 30 years of buried pain. "Where did you get this picture? Why do you have a photo of my mother?" Samuel looked at me, his face pale, his eyes brimming with a mixture of overwhelming love and devastating guilt. He reached for his pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it against his notepad. He wrote 3 frantic words, pulled the paper off, and set it on the desk before me. Ask her memory. Before I could grab his arm, before I could demand an explanation, Samuel turned around and walked out of my office as fast as his aging legs could carry him, leaving me alone in the dim room with two photographs of a past I knew nothing about. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk until dawn, staring at the two photographs side by side under the harsh desk lamp. The questions burned in my brain like fire. How did a janitor in my building possess an intimate photograph of my mother from 40 years ago? Why had my mother never mentioned him? Was he a former lover, a relative, or was he the man who had abandoned us to a life of poverty? At 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, I didn't call my corporate lawyers or my executive team. I called Arthur Vance. Arthur was a private investigator, a former senior detective with the Chicago Police Department whom I had retained for sensitive corporate intelligence matters over the past decade. He was discreet, relentless, and possessed access to archives that few ordinary citizens could touch. 2 hours later, Arthur was sitting in my office, sipping black coffee as he examined the two photographs through a magnifying glass. His name is Samuel Brooks, I told Arthur, my voice tight. He's 72, mute, and works on our night maintenance crew. I need everything you can find on him. Every address, every job, every arrest record, every medical document. I want to know where he was 40 years ago, and I want to know what his connection was to Margaret Jones. Arthur nodded, placing the photographs back down. Give me 48 hours, Andrew. If this man exists in public records, I'll find him. Those 48 hours were the longest of my life. I couldn't focus on work. I canceled executive meetings, ignored emails from investors, and spent hours staring out my window, watching the rain turn into heavy Midwestern snow. Samuel didn't show up for his scheduled shifts over the weekend. HR informed me he had called in sick using the automated messaging system. On Monday afternoon, Arthur walked back into my office, carrying a thick, yellowed manila folder. His face was unusually solemn. "What did you find?" I asked, standing up instantly. Arthur closed the door behind him and sat down. "Andrew, what I found doesn't make sense on the surface. Samuel Brooks isn't a career janitor. In fact, 40 years ago, he was one of the rising stars in structural engineering right here in Illinois." I stared at him, stunned. "An engineer?" "Yes," Arthur said, opening the file and laying out old newspaper clippings and faded public records. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Samuel Brooks was the lead chief designer for Vance and Sterling Construction, one of the largest municipal contracting firms in the Midwest. He designed bridges, high-rises, civic centers. Arthur pulled out a document from 1982, and according to census data and property records from that era, Samuel Brooks lived in an apartment on 42nd Street in South Chicago. His registered domestic partner was Margaret Jones. My breath hitched in my chest. The world seemed to stop spinning. Partner? They weren't legally married, but they lived together for 4 years, Arthur explained softly. By all accounts from old neighbors I managed to contact over the weekend, they were deeply devoted to each other. But then, in October of 1983, everything collapsed. "What happened in 1983?" I asked, leaning over the table, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. Arthur sighed, pointing to a stark, black-and-white newspaper headline from the Chicago Tribune, dated November 12, 1983. "Chief engineer arrested in grand-scale embezzlement and fraud scheme." Samuel Brooks was accused of masterminding a massive financial fraud, Arthur read from the report. Over $2 million, which was a fortune back then, was stolen from a major municipal bridge project. Critical structural safety records were falsified. The evidence against Brooks was overwhelming. Bank accounts in his name were found packed with stolen funds. Falsified inspection logs carried his signature. I stared at the headline, my stomach twisting into a knot. He was a thief? A criminal? He was convicted in 1984, Arthur said quietly, sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security state penitentiary. He served 12 years before being paroled in 1996. "And my mother?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The public records show that shortly after his arrest, Margaret Jones severed all public ties with him. She changed her address, took her maiden name back, and raised her infant son alone in total obscurity. Arthur looked up at me, his eyes filled with sympathy. "Andrew, the timing fits. You were born in September of 1980. Samuel Brooks was arrested in late 1983, when you were 3 years old." I stood frozen in the center of my office, the air leaving my lungs. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they formed a picture so terrifying, so emotionally destructive, that my mind revolted against it. My father hadn't just abandoned us. He was a convicted felon, a fraudster who had disgraced himself and left my mother to pick up the pieces of a ruined life, forcing her to work herself to death in sweatshops while he sat in a prison cell. And now, 30 years later, he had crawled back into my life, sweeping my floors and leaving flowers on my desk. I waited for him. That night, I stayed in my office past midnight. The entire floor was dark, save for the single lamp illuminating my desk, where the investigator's file lay open. At 1:15 a.m., the squeak of rubber wheels against the polished terrazzo floor signaled his arrival. The door to my office opened slowly. Samuel stepped inside, carrying his cleaning bucket. When he saw me sitting behind the desk in the dark, he stopped. He looked at the yellowed file sitting under the lamp, and his expression crumbled into one of immense, soul-crushing grief. He knew I knew. "Why are you here, Samuel?" I asked, my voice cold, sharp, and dripping with decades of accumulated rage. "Or should I call you Mr. Brooks, the brilliant engineer who stole millions and left my mother to die in poverty?" Samuel flinched, as if I had struck him with a physical blow. He stood trembling in the middle of the room, tears welling in his slate-gray eyes. He didn't try to run this time. He slowly reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook, not his usual sticky notes, but a journal that showed years of wear, and stepped forward. With hands that shook uncontrollably, he placed the notebook on my desk and pushed it toward me. "I don't want your notebook," I shouted, standing up and slamming my palms onto the mahogany surface. "I want answers. You let my mother suffer. She worked 3 jobs. She wrecked her hands, her health, her life, raising me alone, while you were locked away in a prison cell for being a greedy thief. And then you have the audacity to walk into my company, sweep my floors, and pretend to care about me?" Samuel squeezed his eyes shut, a silent sob racking his old frame. He didn't write a defense. He simply pointed at the notebook, his eyes pleading with me to open it. I glared at him, my chest heaving with hot, suffocating anger. But as I looked at his frail, stooped posture, the silent desperation in his eyes broke through my anger, just enough to make me reach for the leather book. I flipped it open. The journal was filled with years of entry notes, written in crisp, precise handwriting. It was a record of a life lived in total silence and solitary devotion. I began to read. March 14th, 1988. Today, Andrew turned 8 years old. I managed to get a picture of him from a distance near his elementary school. He has Margaret's smile. He looks healthy. Thank God he is healthy. I sit in this cell every night and pray that he never knows the stain of my name. August 22nd, 1996. I was released today, 12 years of silence. I went to the old apartment, but Margaret and Andrew were gone. I found out Margaret passed away 2 years ago. My heart is completely broken. I couldn't even say goodbye to her. I couldn't tell her the truth. May 12th, 2012. Andrew's company went public today. I stood outside the stock exchange in the rain and watched him on the giant screens. He looked so strong, so powerful. He doesn't need a father like me. A father who was a convict would only drag him down into the mud. It is better that he thinks I am dead. October 4th, 2026. I got the job on the cleaning crew at Aegis. I know it is selfish. I know I shouldn't be here. But my body is failing, and I just wanted to be near him before my time comes. I just wanted to see my son one last time. I stared at the words, my throat tightening, a terrible knot forming in my stomach. The journal was full of agonizing love, but nowhere in those pages did he explain the crime. Nowhere did he claim his innocence. I looked up at him, my voice trembling with confusion and pain. "You wrote all this? You watched me for decades, but you still haven't answered the fundamental question. Did you commit those crimes? Did you ruin our lives for money?" Samuel looked at me with an expression of profound sadness. He took the pen, opened to a blank page at the back of the notebook, and began to write with slow, heavy strokes. When he finished, he turned the pad around. "I loved your mother more than my own life," he wrote. "I never took a single penny, but I let them take me away, because it was the only way to keep you and Margaret alive." My world collapsed into utter chaos in that moment. "What do you mean, keep us alive?" I demanded, coming around the desk to stand directly in front of him. "What are you talking about, Samuel? Talk to me. Tell me." Samuel looked at me, tears streaming down his face. He reached into his deep canvas work bag, resting on his cleaning cart, and pulled out a worn, heavy steel box, locked with a small padlock. He pulled a key from around his neck, unlocked the box, and turned it over onto my desk. A flood of original, official documents spilled across the polished wood. I dropped to my knees beside the desk, frantically pulling through the papers. These were not photocopies, they were original, primary documents, preserved for over 40 years. There were original hospital records from South Chicago General, dated September 14, 1980, my birth certificate, listing Samuel Arthur Brooks as my father and Margaret Elizabeth Jones as my mother. There were hundreds of handwritten love letters bound by twine, written between Samuel and my mother during his years in structural school and early career, letters filled with poetry, dreams of buying a small house with a garden, and plans for our future. There were honorable discharge military papers from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, showing Samuel had served 4 years with distinction before entering private industry. And then, at the bottom of the box, lay a thick legal folder labeled Vance and Sterling Construction, Internal Audit and Defense Evidence, 1983. I opened the folder. Inside were official corporate documents, internal memos, and banking records that had never been introduced in court. I read through them with growing horror as the horrifying truth began to unspool before my eyes. In 1983, Samuel had been the lead structural engineer on the construction of the major Harrison Avenue Bridge in Chicago. During a routine quality audit, Samuel discovered that the executive board of Vance and Sterling, headed by CEO Richard Vance and senior partner Thomas Sterling, had been systematically cutting corners. They had used substandard, cheap concrete and compromised structural steel to pocket millions in state construction grants. When Samuel realized the bridge was structurally unsafe and threatened to report them to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Vance and Sterling retaliated with ruthless, monstrous force. They didn't just threaten his career, they hired corrupt elements within local law enforcement to intimidate him. One evening in October 1983, Samuel returned home to find his apartment ransacked. Sitting on the kitchen table was a photograph of my mother holding me in the park, accompanied by a typed note. "If you go to the FBI, the concrete won't just go into the bridge. It will go around your wife and infant son. Sign the confession, take the fraud charge, and your family stays safe. Put up a fight, and you will watch them die before we put you in the ground." Samuel had been trapped in a nightmare. He had no power, no money to fight billionaire contractors who owned politicians and judges. To save my mother's life, to save my life, Samuel signed a pre-drafted confession, taking full responsibility for the embezzlement and structural fraud. He allowed himself to be publicly disgraced, branded a master thief, and sent to a maximum security prison for 12 years. He had sacrificed his name, his career, his freedom, and his entire future to ensure that a 3-year-old boy and his mother could live. And to make certain that Richard Vance never came back to finish the job, Samuel had cut off all contact with Margaret, making the corrupt executives believe he was broken and that Margaret knew nothing. My mother never knew the full extent of his sacrifice. She only knew that the man she loved had suddenly vanished into the prison system, leaving her with a broken heart and a baby to raise. I sat on the floor of my office, holding the 40-year-old threat note in my trembling hands. The room was deathly quiet, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. 30 years of hatred, 30 years of believing my father was a coward who had abandoned me, dissolved into ash in a single, devastating instant. I looked up from the floor. Samuel was standing over me, his head bowed, tears dropping onto the carpet. He slowly sank to his knees beside me on the floor, his old, frail body shaking with decades of suppressed agony. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitated for a second, as if feeling he was unworthy to touch me, and then softly laid his palm against my cheek. His stroke-damaged throat worked frantically, fighting against the nerve damage that had silenced him for years. And then, in a dry, raspy, barely audible whisper that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete, a single word forced its way out of his mouth. "Son." I collapsed forward, throwing my arms around my father's stooped shoulders, and for the first time since I was a 16-year-old boy sitting in a hospital room, I wept uncontrollably. We spent the rest of that night sitting side by side on the sofa in my office, watching the snow fall over Chicago as the sky slowly turned from pitch black to deep indigo. With his notebook and his raspy, whispered fragments, Samuel filled in the painful chapters of the years that had been stolen from us. After he went to prison in 1984, he served his sentence in the brutal environment of Menard Correctional Center. He kept his head down, taking the worst work details, surviving on the single hope that one day he might be released and see us from afar. When he was paroled in 1996, he immediately went searching for us. But Margaret, desperate to protect me from the stigma of his conviction, had moved 3 times and changed our legal last name from Brooks to her maiden name, Jones. By the time Samuel finally tracked down our old neighborhood, he discovered that my mother had passed away 2 years earlier from late-stage cervical cancer. He went to her grave in St. Mary's Cemetery alone, kneeling in the grass, begging her forgiveness for a sacrifice she had never fully understood. Tragedy struck him again in 2008. While working a night shift as a warehouse stalker, Samuel suffered a severe ischemic stroke. He survived, but the damage to his brain permanently destroyed his vocal cords and paralyzed his right arm for months. It took him 2 years of intense physical therapy just to walk again and use his hand to write. He was old, destitute, voiceless, and utterly alone. He watched my rise in the business world from afar. He bought newspapers that featured my picture, cutting out every article and taping them into his journal. He watched televised interviews of me speaking at technology summits. He saw the cold, guarded man I had become, a man who had built a corporate empire to hide his wounded heart. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked him, holding his rough, calloused hand in mine. "When I made my first million, when I built this company, why didn't you come to my front door and tell me?" Samuel took his pen and wrote on his notepad with slow, deliberate care. "Look at what you achieved, Andrew. You became a great man, without the shadow of a convict father hanging over you. If I had come into your life earlier, the media would have destroyed your reputation. They would have called your company the creation of a thief's son. I wanted you to stand tall, unburdened by my past." He paused, looking at me with eyes filled with boundless, unconditional love. "I only came here as a janitor because I felt my body getting weaker. My heart is failing, Andrew. The doctors say I don't have much time left. I couldn't leave this world without seeing your face up close just once, without making sure you were taking care of yourself." The sheer magnitude of his selflessness hit me like a physical blow. For 40 years, this man had endured prison, poverty, illness, humiliation, and utter loneliness, not for fame, not for wealth, but simply to keep me safe and watch me succeed from the shadows. He was not a coward. He was not a deadbeat. He was the bravest, most loving father a man could ever ask for. My sorrow quickly transformed into a cold, uncompromising fury against the men who had stolen my father's life. Richard Vance and Thomas Sterling were now elderly men in their late 70s, living as wealthy, celebrated philanthropists in Chicago's elite social circles. Their company, Vance and Sterling, had evolved into a massive real estate conglomerate. They had built their fortune on the ruined life of my father, completely untouched by the law. They thought the past was buried. They thought a voiceless, 72-year-old ex-con could never threaten them. They didn't realize that the ex-con's son was now one of the most powerful and wealthy executives in the state of Illinois. I mobilized the full power of my resources. I didn't just hire Arthur Vance. I hired an elite legal team specializing in corporate crime, along with top forensic accountants and private intelligence investigators. We spent 3 intense weeks meticulously analyzing the original documents from Samuel's steel box. We cross-referenced the falsified engineering reports with state infrastructure archives. My security specialists decrypted old corporate servers that Arthur managed to legally subpoena, uncovering internal correspondence from 1983 that explicitly detailed how Vance and Sterling had framed Samuel Brooks to cover up their corrupt concrete scheme. We found the smoking gun, an offshore wire transfer record from November 1983, showing a $50,000 payment made by Richard Vance to the original trial judge who had overseen Samuel's conviction. On a freezing Tuesday morning in January 2027, I held a massive, unannounced press conference in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago. Over 200 journalists from major news outlets packed the room. I stood at the podium, flanked by my legal team. Beside me sat my father, Samuel, wearing a sharp, custom charcoal suit I had bought for him, his posture dignified and calm. I spoke into the microphones, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the national broadcast. 43 years ago, an innocent man, a brilliant structural engineer, and a decorated military veteran, was framed for a crime he did not commit. He was threatened with the murder of his wife and infant son if he did not take the fall for corrupt billionaires who were building unsafe public infrastructure. That man served 12 years in prison. He lost his reputation, his career, his health, his voice, and his family. I turned and looked at Samuel, laying my hand firmly on his shoulder. That man's name is Samuel Brooks. He is my father, and today we are presenting undeniable, ironclad forensic evidence to the United States Department of Justice and the state's attorney to exonerate his name completely. The room erupted into a frenzy of camera flashes and shouting reporters. The legal hammer fell with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, the Cook County Circuit Court reopened the 1984 conviction based on the newly surfaced evidence. The state's attorney filed an emergency motion to vacate all charges against Samuel Brooks, issuing a formal, public state apology for the egregious miscarriage of justice. Federal agents executed search warrants on the offices of Vance and Sterling. Richard Vance and Thomas Sterling, both 78 years old, were arrested at their Lake Forest mansions, exposed as frauds, and indicted on federal charges of racketeering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The story dominated national headlines for weeks. The nation watched in awe as the quiet Mute Janitor, who had been swept into the dustbin of history, was fully, publicly vindicated as an American hero who had sacrificed everything to protect his family. Justice in a courtroom is necessary, but it does not automatically heal a broken heart. Reclaiming 30 lost years requires a different kind of work, a slow, tender work that cannot be rushed by money or legal verdicts. I immediately resigned from my active daily duties as CEO of Aegis Cybersecurity, appointing my trusted Chief Operating Officer to manage company operations. For the first time in my 46 years, work was no longer my top priority. I moved my father out of his cramped, dilapidated studio apartment in West Chicago and brought him to live with me at my penthouse. The first few weeks were awkward and filled with quiet hesitation. We were two grown men, strangers in many ways, trying to navigate a father-son relationship that had been frozen in time when I was 3 years old. Samuel was unused to luxury. For decades, he had lived in deep poverty, expecting nothing from the world. When I showed him his master bedroom suite overlooking the lake, he stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, refusing to step on the plush rug with his shoes. "Dad," I said gently, taking his arm and leading him inside. "This is your home now. Everything I have belongs to you." Slowly, step by step, we found our rhythm. Every morning at 7, we sat together in the sunlit breakfast nook. I didn't drink expensive cafe espresso anymore. I brewed chicory coffee with nutmeg, just as he used to make for me. Samuel would read the morning paper, and I would read his handwritten notes, discussing everything from politics and architecture to memories of my mother. He taught me about structural engineering. He showed me sketchbooks he had kept over 40 years, filled with brilliant designs for bridges and buildings he had dreamed of constructing while sitting in a prison cell. I taught him how to use a modern digital tablet, allowing him to type out his thoughts faster than writing by hand. On weekends, we took long, quiet walks along the shores of Lake Michigan. Samuel walked slowly, leaning on a wooden cane, and I walked right beside him, adjusting my pace to match his. People would pass us, executives, joggers, tourists, never guessing that the billionaire CEO and the quiet old man holding his arm were rewriting 40 years of lost history. One crisp afternoon in April, we drove out to St. Mary's Cemetery in South Chicago. The sky was clear blue, and a warm spring breeze rustled the fresh leaves on the oak trees. We walked together down the quiet stone path until we reached a modest headstone nestled under a weeping willow tree. Margaret Jones, 1956-1994. Beloved mother and devoted soul. Samuel knelt down in the soft grass before the grave. His old knees cracked, but he paid no attention to the pain. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a fresh, beautiful white lily. He laid the flower gently against the cold granite stone. He pressed his hands together, closed his eyes, and bowed his head. Tears flowed freely down his lined face, but they were no longer tears of bitter despair. They were tears of peace, of closure, of a promise finally kept. I knelt down beside him on the grass, placing my arm around his frail shoulders. "She always loved you, Dad," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Her last words to me were telling me not to hate you, telling me that one day I would understand. Samuel looked at me, his gray eyes shining with quiet comfort. He reached out and placed his hand over mine, resting on Margaret's headstone. We sat there together in the quiet cemetery for hours, three souls finally reunited under the spring sun. Healing is not just about fixing what was broken in the past. It is about building something meaningful for the future. 6 months after my father's exoneration, I established the Margaret and Samuel Brooks Foundation, backed by a $50 million endowment from my personal wealth. The foundation was built with a single, clear mission: to provide world-class legal representation, forensic investigation, and re-entry support for low-income individuals who have been wrongfully convicted or framed by systemic corruption. We built legal clinics in major cities across America, hiring top-tier defense attorneys and investigators to fight for forgotten men and women who, like my father, had been silenced by a system that favored the rich and powerful. I also established a national support network for the children of incarcerated parents, offering full university scholarships and mentorship programs to ensure that no child ever had to carry the shame and isolation that I had carried for 30 years. My father served as the chief honorary advisor to the foundation. Every week, despite his declining health, Samuel would sit in our Chicago headquarters, reviewing case files brought in by our legal team. Though he couldn't speak, his incredible structural mind and his deep, lived understanding of justice allowed him to spot inconsistencies in prosecution reports that young lawyers missed. He gave hope to dozens of families. When a wrongfully convicted mother or father was finally freed from prison through our foundation's efforts, Samuel was always there at the prison gates to greet them, offering a silent nod, a warm embrace, and a handwritten note: "Welcome back to your life. Your children are waiting." On a quiet Sunday evening in late July, my father and I sat on the balcony of our penthouse, watching the sunset over the deep blue horizon of Lake Michigan. The doctor had visited earlier that afternoon. Samuel's heart was growing weaker, his pulse slowing down with each passing week. We both knew that our time together in this world was drawing to a close. But there was no fear in the room. There was no regret. Samuel turned his head toward me. His face was pale, but his slate-gray eyes were bright, peaceful, and filled with a warmth that illuminated the evening dimness. He picked up his small notepad from the glass table, wrote one final message, and handed it to me. I read his neat, elegant handwriting under the soft twilight. "I spent 40 years living in dark and silent places, Andrew. I thought my life was a failure. But standing here with you, seeing the man you have become, and knowing that our story is helping thousands of others find their way home, I know now that every tear, every prison bar, and every silent night was worth it. You are my greatest masterpiece." I set the notepad down. I looked at my father, this quiet, stoic man who had swept floors in my company just to be near me, the man who had traded his entire life to keep me safe. I didn't offer a corporate speech. I didn't quote philosophy. I leaned forward, wrapped my arms around his stooped shoulders, and pulled him close to my chest, holding him tight against the cool evening breeze. Samuel rested his head against my shoulder, his frail hand gripping my arm with all the remaining strength he possessed. Neither of us said a word. Neither of us needed to. Because in that deep, sacred silence, 40 years of pain, distance, and lost time vanished completely, replaced by an everlasting truth that no crime, no prison, and no silence could ever destroy. He was my father, I was his son, and we were finally, truly home. The morning after Samuel revealed his identity, the silence in my penthouse took on a radically different weight. I stood in my expansive kitchen at 5:30 a.m., watching the blue light of early dawn filter through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The espresso machine sat sleek and polished on the white marble countertop, a $10,000 appliance I had bought simply because it matched the minimalist aesthetic of my home. But my hands bypassed it entirely. Instead, I pulled out a simple stainless steel pot, filled it with water, and brought out the chicory coffee and ground nutmeg I had purchased from a small specialty grocery store the night before. As the water began to simmer, I heard soft, uneven footsteps echoing down the hardwood hallway. Samuel stepped into the kitchen. He was dressed in a simple, oversized cardigan over a soft cotton shirt, clothes I had ordered for him late the previous night, so he wouldn't have to wear his faded Navy janitorial uniform ever again. He looked frail without the structure of his heavy work boots, his shoulders hunched inward as if he were trying to occupy as little space in the world as possible. He paused at the edge of the kitchen, his slate-gray eyes darting nervously across the polished marble, high-end appliances, and art pieces hanging on the walls. He looked terrified to step forward, like a man who believed he was trespassing in a sanctuary where he didn't belong. "Good morning, Dad," I said, my voice quiet, testing the word dad aloud in the early light. Samuel's hands began to tremble. He reached into his shirt pocket out of instinct, looking for his small notepad, but his fingers found only empty fabric. I had forgotten to put a pad in his new sweater. I poured 2 ceramic mugs of chicory coffee, walked across the kitchen, and handed one to him. He accepted it with both hands, his fingers brushing against mine. His skin was dry and cool, rough as sandpaper from decades of exposure to industrial solvents and harsh weather. He looked down at the dark, steaming liquid, caught the distinct scent of nutmeg, and looked back up at me. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking slowly down the deep crease beside his cheekbone. "Come sit down," I told him, guiding him toward the leather chairs in the breakfast nook facing the lake. We sat together in total silence for 20 minutes, sipping the hot, bitter coffee. For 30 years, my mornings had been a race against the clock, a frantic cycle of checking Asian markets, reading threat intelligence reports, and preparing for board conflicts. Now, watching my father's chest rise and fall in the quiet light, I realized that my entire life had been an exercise in running away from a memory. "I need to know everything, Dad," I said softly, laying my hands flat on the wooden table. "Not just the legal facts Arthur found. I need to know what happened to you on the inside." Samuel set his mug down with painstaking care. He reached for a leather-bound notebook I had set on the table for him, uncapped a gel pen, and began to write. The tip of the pen scratched rhythmically against the heavy paper. "The hardest part of prison wasn't the cold," he wrote, his penmanship tight and meticulous. "It wasn't the guards or the dangerous men. The hardest part was 4 o'clock in the afternoon." I leaned closer. "Why 4 o'clock?" "Because at 4 o'clock in our apartment on 42nd Street, your mother would sit you on the floor and put on the radio. You would laugh and try to dance before dinner. In my cell, every day at 4 o'clock, the silence would scream at me. I could close my eyes and hear your laugh, but when I opened them, there were only concrete walls." He looked up at me, his eyes overflowing with an unbearable, ancient sorrow. "I wanted to write to her," he continued on the paper. "I wrote hundreds of letters during my first 2 years in Menard, but Richard Vance made sure I understood the rules. A week after I was processed, a guard dropped an envelope into my cell. Inside was a photograph of you playing in the courtyard outside your building. On the back, Vance had written, 'Keep your mouth shut and stay away from them, or we will visit the boy.' I burned every letter I wrote to your mother that night in the stainless steel toilet bowl. I let her hate me so she would keep you safe. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. The sheer, calculated malice of Richard Vance and Thomas Sterling made my blood run cold. They hadn't just framed an innocent man, they had weaponized a father's love to enforce his silence for 4 decades. "They're going to pay for this, Dad," I whispered, the words heavy with a dark, unyielding promise. "I built Aegis to protect people from invisible threats. I swear to you on my life, I will use every dollar, every resource, and every connection I have to tear down everything Vance and Sterling built." Samuel looked at me, a deep look of concern washing over his face. He quickly wrote, "Do not ruin your life for revenge, Andrew. You are clean. Do not drag yourself into the mud for a dead past." I reached across the table and covered his trembling, ink-stained hand with my own. "It's not revenge, Dad. It's justice, and it's 40 years overdue." By noon that same day, my private office at Aegis had been transformed into a legal and financial war room. I had assembled an elite team: Arthur Vance, my lead private investigator, Eleanor Ross, a ruthless former federal prosecutor who now headed my corporate legal defense team, and Marcus Vance, a brilliant young forensic accountant who could trace a single dollar through 20 offshore shell companies. We sat around the large conference table in my suite. Samuel sat in a comfortable armchair near the window, quietly watching us. Though he was not an active participant in our conversation, his presence anchor-weighted every sentence spoken in that room. "Here is what we are up against," Eleanor said, throwing a thick binder onto the table. "Richard Vance is 78 years old. Thomas Sterling is 76. They retired from active management of Vance and Sterling Construction 5 years ago, but they still hold 60% of the equity through a series of complex family trusts based in Delaware." "What about the Harrison Avenue Bridge project?" I asked, leaning forward with my arms crossed. "That's where things get dark," Arthur chimed in, opening a blue folder containing faded municipal archives. "The state safety inspections from 1983 were buried, but I managed to locate a retired state engineer named Harold Miller who worked the secondary inspection team. He's 82 now, living in a retirement home in Naperville." "Will he talk?" Eleanor asked. "He already did," Arthur said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I visited him yesterday. Miller told me that in October of 1983, 3 weeks before Samuel was arrested, Miller raised serious flags about the core concrete samples taken from the bridge's main support pillars. He found that the concrete mixture was heavily diluted with cheap fly ash, making it prone to internal cracking under heavy loads. "And what happened when he reported it?" I demanded. "The next morning, Miller was pulled into a private office by Thomas Sterling," Arthur explained, reading from his notes. "Sterling handed him an envelope containing $15,000 in cash and told him his pension would be revoked and his family ruined if he didn't alter the core sample reports. Miller took the money, kept quiet, and spent 40 years living with the guilt." Eleanor leaned back in her leather chair, her sharp eyes scanning the documents. "A 40-year-old verbal statement from an 82-year-old witness won't stand up alone in federal court, Andrew. The statute of limitations on simple fraud expired decades ago. To bring Vance and Sterling down today, we need to prove an ongoing active criminal conspiracy, something that links their past crimes to their current financial empire." Marcus, the forensic accountant, tapped his laptop screen. "I think I have that link." Everyone in the room turned to look at him. "I spent the last 18 hours running a deep forensic audit on Vance and Sterling's public financial disclosures from 1983 to the present," Marcus said, his voice brimming with excitement. "When Samuel took the fall for the $2 million fraud in 1983, where did that stolen $2 million actually go?" "The state records said Samuel hid it in offshore accounts in the Bahamas," I noted. "That was the official prosecution narrative," Marcus countered. "But looking at the bank routing ledgers from that exact month, that $2 million never left Chicago. It was funneled through 3 ghost companies registered under the names of Richard Vance's brother-in-law. 2 months later, in January 1984, those exact same ghost companies used that $2 million as collateral to secure a $20 million commercial loan to build the Sterling Plaza high-rise in downtown Chicago." Marcus looked directly at me. Every single dollar of the multi-billion-dollar Vance and Sterling real estate empire was built directly on the seed capital stolen from the Harrison Avenue Bridge project. Furthermore, because that original money was acquired through extortion and falsified federal construction records, every profit generated by their family trusts today constitutes an ongoing violation of the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute. Eleanor's eyes lit up. A RICO charge has no statute of limitations if the enterprise is still active and generating revenue from the predicate criminal acts. Precisely, Marcus smiled. They didn't just commit a crime 40 years ago, they have been actively laundering the proceeds of that crime every single day for 40 years. I turned my head and looked across the room at Samuel. He was sitting quietly by the glass, his hands resting on his knees. He looked back at me, his slate-gray eyes calm, completely devoid of the malice and greed that drove men like Vance and Sterling. He didn't want their money. He didn't want their empire demolished out of spite. He simply wanted the truth to set his name free. "Build the case, Eleanor," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "Coordinate with the United States Attorney's Office. I don't care how much it costs. I want the indictments ready before the month is out." 2 weeks before the public press conference at the Drake Hotel, I did something my legal team strongly advised against. I arranged a private meeting with Richard Vance. Through my corporate contacts, I secured an invitation to an exclusive, invitation-only charity gala hosted at the Art Institute of Chicago. The city's corporate elite were out in full force. Billionaires, politicians, tech founders, and real estate tycoons, sipping vintage champagne among masterpiece paintings. Richard Vance was standing near a Monet canvas in the European Gallery, leaning on an ivory-handled walking stick. Despite his advanced age, he still possessed the air of an untouchable titan, impeccably groomed in a tuxedo, surrounded by 2 young associates and a state senator. I walked straight through the crowd, my tailored tux sharp, my posture tall. "Mr. Vance," I said, stepping into his circle. Vance turned, his sharp, icy blue eyes assessing me. A politician's smile touched his thin lips. "Ah, Andrew Jones, the wunderkind of Chicago cybersecurity. I was hoping I'd run into you tonight. Your company's third-quarter earnings were impressive." "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I said smoothly. "I actually wanted to ask you a brief question regarding structural engineering." Vance chuckled, waving his hand dismissively to his associates, signaling them to step back. "Engineering? Andrew, I haven't looked at a blueprint in 15 years. I leave that to the young men now. I'm interested in a specific project," I said, dropping my voice so only he could hear. "The Harrison Avenue Bridge, built in 1983. Vance's smiling eyes instantly turned cold as ice. The warmth vanished from his posture, replaced by a sudden, dangerous rigidity. He leaned slightly on his cane, his knuckles turning white. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Jones," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its charming social edge. "A tragic situation. A rogue engineer stole millions and compromised public safety. The company handled it, corrected the mistakes, and moved on. The rogue engineer was Samuel Brooks," I said quietly, stepping 6 inches closer to him. Vance narrowed his eyes. "I remember the name. A weak man who broke under pressure. Why are you bringing up a dead scandal from 40 years ago?" "Because Samuel Brooks isn't dead," I whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive cologne and stale scotch on his breath. "And he wasn't weak. He took your fall because you threatened to murder his wife and infant child." Vance didn't gasp. He didn't flinch. A man who has operated in corruption for half a century does not easily lose his composure. Instead, a cold, mocking smirk spread slowly across his aged face. "You should be very careful, Mr. Jones," Vance said, his tone dripping with quiet menace. "Making baseless allegations against respected civic leaders can ruin a young man's career. Slander is an expensive hobby." "It's not slander when you have the paper trail, Richard," I replied, my voice steady as steel. "I have the core sample reports from Harold Miller. I have the wire transfers to the ghost companies that built Sterling Plaza. I have the legal team that is filing federal RICO charges with the Department of Justice on Monday morning." Vance's smirk finally withered. A tiny, involuntary tremor shook his right eyelid. And most importantly, I continued, taking a step back and looking down at him with utter contempt, Samuel Brooks is my father, and the infant child you threatened 40 years ago is standing right in front of you. Vance stared at me, his breath hitching slightly in his chest. For the first time in his long, ruthless life, he was looking at a man who could not be bought, intimidated, or destroyed by his money. "Enjoy your champagne tonight, Richard," I said softly. "It's the last taste of freedom you're ever going to have." I turned on my heel and walked out of the gallery, leaving the billionaire standing alone under the museum lights, looking old, frail, and terrified. In the months following the explosive press conference and the subsequent arrests of Vance and Sterling, the noise of the outside world began to fade. The media frenzy eventually died down. The legal proceedings moved through the slow, methodical gears of the federal court system, but inside my penthouse high above Lake Michigan, time seemed to slow down completely, allowing space for a quiet, delicate domestic life to take root. I realized very quickly that my father had no concept of how to exist without hard labor. For 48 years, from his early days in engineering school to his 12 years in Menard Penitentiary and his 3 decades of janitorial work, his identity had been entirely defined by sacrifice, routine, and struggle. During our first month living together, I would wake up at 6 a.m. to find Samuel trying to vacuum the penthouse carpets or clean the floor-to-ceiling windows with a rag. One morning, I gently walked up to him, took the microfiber cloth from his hands, and set it down on the table. "Dad," I said softly, "you don't have to clean anymore. You are not a janitor here. You are my father." Samuel looked at his empty hands, looking lost and uncomfortable. He picked up his tablet and typed out a quick note. "If I am not working, Andrew, I feel like a ghost. I don't know how to just sit in a chair." That note broke my heart. I realized that retirement felt like punishment to a man who had used manual labor to numb his emotional pain for 30 years. "Then let's find work that builds something," I told him. That afternoon, high-grade architectural paper, precision T-squares, compasses, and professional drawing pencils, the exact tools Samuel had used as a young engineer in the 1970s. When I opened the door and showed him the room, Samuel stood frozen on the threshold. He walked slowly toward the drafting table, his worn fingers gently tracing the smooth tilt of the wooden surface. He picked up a drafting pencil, balancing it in his palm, as if reacquainting his hands with an old, long-lost friend. Tears filled his eyes. He sat down on the high stool, adjusted the desk lamp, and began to draw. For the next 4 months, that room became Samuel's sanctuary. He didn't draw high-rise office towers or commercial plazas. He drew bridges, dozens of exquisite, highly detailed architectural designs for pedestrian bridges, small river crossings, and community park walkways. His lines were amazingly crisp, his mathematical calculations in the margins precise and elegant. Every evening after dinner, I would sit on a sofa in his studio, reading corporate books while he worked at his board under the warm glow of the lamp. Occasionally, he would stop drafting, tap his pencil against the paper to get my attention, and show me a specific joint or support beam design. He would type out short explanations on his tablet. "A good bridge doesn't just hold weight, Andrew. It absorbs force. It allows 2 places that were separated by a chasm to touch each other." "Is that what we're doing, Dad?" I asked him one evening, looking at a beautifully detailed sketch of a stone arch bridge over a quiet stream. "Building a bridge across 30 years? Samuel set his pencil down. He turned around on his stool, looked at me with deep affection, and typed a single line on his screen. "The chasm was wide, my son, but love is a very strong anchor." As summer gave way to the cool, crisp days of autumn 2027, Samuel's physical health began to visibly decline. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial Hospital had been clear with me months earlier. The combination of his past stroke, years of neglected hypertension, and advanced congestive heart failure meant his heart was operating at less than 25% capacity. Medication could ease his discomfort, but it could not reverse the gradual shutting down of his body. He grew tired more easily. His long walks along the lakefront shortened to brief strolls in the garden courtyard near our building. His drafting sessions at the wooden table reduced from hours to short, quiet half-hours in the afternoon. Yet, As his physical strength waned, his spirit seemed lighter than it had ever been. The deep, permanent furrow between his brows had smoothed out. The haunted, hyper-vigilant look in his gray eyes was replaced by a calm, radiant serenity. One evening in late September, a violent rainstorm rattled the glass windows of the penthouse, the kind of dramatic Midwestern storm that always reminded me of my childhood in South Chicago. I was sitting beside Samuel in the living room. He was resting in a deep leather armchair, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the sheet rain wash over the city lights below. "Dad," I said softly, setting my book down on the side table, "do you ever feel angry about what happened? About losing Mom? About losing your career?" Samuel turned his head slowly toward me. He reached for his tablet, his hand moving more slowly now, his fingers slightly unsteady on the touchscreen. He typed for several minutes, pausing occasionally to gaze out at the rain. Finally, he held up the glowing screen for me to read. In my early years in Menard, I was consumed by rage. I hated Richard Vance. I hated the corrupt judges. I hated the guards. I hated God for letting an innocent man suffer while wicked men prospered. But anger is like holding a hot coal in your hand, while expecting the other person to burn. It ate away at my soul until I realized something crucial. If I spent my life hating them, they would steal my spirit too, not just my freedom. I stopped hating them. I started praying for your mother's safety, and for your future. And when I was released, every day I lived, even sweeping floors, even sitting in cold rooms, was made bearable because I knew you were alive and safe. He paused, adjusting his blanket, and then typed one more paragraph. "Do not waste a single hour of your life hating what was taken from us, Andrew. Look at what we found instead. Some men live 80 years and never know if they were loved. I know I am loved by my son. That makes me the richest man in Chicago." I read the screen, my throat aching with a thick, suffocating lump of emotion. I took the tablet from his hands, set it aside, and sat on the floor beside his armchair, resting my arm on his knee, just as I used to do with my mother when I was a little boy. Samuel laid his dry, warm palm on top of my head, his fingers gently threading through my dark hair. We sat together in the dark room, listening to the rain beat against the glass. Two men who had lost everything, survived the storm, and found total peace in the quiet light of forgiveness. Samuel Brooks passed away peacefully in his sleep on a quiet Sunday morning in late October 2027, just as the first dusting of winter snow began to settle over the quiet streets of Chicago. He went without pain, surrounded by the warmth of his home, with a framed photograph of my mother sitting on the table beside his bed and a fresh white lily resting in a glass vase nearby. His funeral was not a somber, gloomy corporate affair. It was held at a small, historic stone chapel near the lake. Over 300 people attended. There were legal scholars, young defense attorneys, civil rights advocates, and former prisoners whose freedom had been restored by the Margaret and Samuel Brooks Foundation. But there were also the ordinary working people of Aegis Cybersecurity, the night maintenance workers, the security guards, the cafeteria staff, and the young software engineers whom Samuel had quietly cared for when he was sweeping floors in the dark. David, the young software engineer whom Samuel had covered with a wool blanket years earlier, stood near the back of the chapel, quietly wiping away tears. I stood at the wooden pulpit, looking out at the gathered crowd. Behind me sat a simple mahogany casket, draped in white lilies. I didn't read a formal eulogy. I spoke straight from my heart. My father, Samuel Brooks, spent 40 years of his life in complete silence, I told the room, my voice echoing clearly through the stone arches. The world tried to strip him of his name, his reputation, his freedom, and his voice. They thought that by locking him away and forcing him into poverty, they had destroyed him. I looked out at the faces of the people whose lives my father had touched. They were wrong, I continued, feeling a sudden, powerful warmth spread through my chest. My father was the loudest man I have ever known. He spoke not with words, but with sacrifice. He spoke with dignity. He spoke through every act of quiet kindness, every bridge he designed, every life he protected, and every tear he wiped away. He taught me that true strength is not measured by the size of the empire you build or the wealth you accumulate, True strength is measured by how much of your own life you are willing to lay down to keep the people you love safe. After the service, we laid my father to rest at St. Mary's Cemetery, right beside my mother, Margaret. After 40 years of separation, trial, sacrifice, and silence, they were finally lying side by side under the shade of the weeping willow tree, reunited forever under the quiet sky. Today, my life is completely different. I return to Aegis cybersecurity, but I am no longer the cold, isolated billionaire who locks himself in a 65th floor office to escape his past. Every morning when I walk through the glass doors of our headquarters, I stop to talk to our maintenance staff, our security guards, and our young interns. I know their names. I know their stories. I treat every single person in that building with the profound dignity that my father showed the world. The Margaret and Samuel Brooks Foundation continues to expand across the United States. To date, our legal team has successfully exonerated 42 wrongfully convicted men and women, restoring mothers and fathers to their children, breaking the chains of injustice that had bound them for decades. Every Monday morning, when I walk into my private office at Aegis, I find a fresh white lily sitting in a glass vase on my mahogany desk. My assistant didn't put it there, I put it there myself. It serves as a constant, beautiful reminder of the Mute Janitor who walked into my life with a mop and a bucket, broke down the walls of my cold, lonely heart, and showed me the true meaning of family, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes in forgiveness, hope, and second chances.